The drilling machine broke through the last layer of ice, and Michael Park felt the ground shake beneath his feet. He grabbed the metal railing and watched as chunks of frozen rock tumbled into the darkness below the Corvani workers around him. Made clicking sounds with their mandibles, which his translator device told him meant excitement. Dr. Velox stood at the edge of the newly opened pit. His tall insectoid body was covered in a protective suit that shimmered under the floodlights. His four eyes reflected the glow from the hole in the ground, and his antennae twitched rapidly. "We have done it," the alien archaeologist announced. His voice came through the translator as a calm monotone, but Michael had learned to read Corvani body language over the past 6 months. The way Velox kept shifting his weight from one leg to another meant he was barely containing his joy. Michael pulled up his collar against the freezing wind of Theta 7. This moon was nothing but ice and rock floating in the outer reaches of a dead solar system. Nobody had expected to find anything here. The original survey team had only stopped to collect mineral samples, but their ground-penetrating radar had picked up something strange. Structure buried 3 kilometers below the surface. That discovery had brought the Galactic Archaeological Council running. They had assembled the best minds from 12 different species, all of them eager to uncover the secrets of what they were already calling the Theta 7 anomaly. Michael was the only human on the team, and he was not there for his expertise. He was a liaison, a fancy word for translator and cultural advisor. The Galactic Council had rules about including representatives from all member species and major discoveries. Humanity had only joined the galactic community 15 years ago, and they were still considered the new kids on the block. Nobody expected Michael to contribute anything meaningful to the actual research. The first team descended into the pit using gravity harnesses. Michael watched them disappear into the darkness. Their helmet lights became tiny dots and then vanished completely. He waited at the surface with the support crew, listening to the chatter. On the communication channel, "The shaft goes down another 200 meters, one of the Corvani reported. "The walls are smooth. Too smooth." This was not natural formation. Michael felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold wind. Something about this place felt wrong. He could not explain it, but his instincts were screaming at him. Every human on Earth knew that feeling. The sense that you were being watched. The sense that you were standing somewhere you did not belong. The team reached the bottom of the shaft, and Michael heard gasps through his earpiece. Even the normally stoic Corvani were making sounds of amazement. "By the ancient stars," Dr. Velox breathed, "it is beautiful." Michael waited for someone to describe what they were seeing, but the team had gone silent. He shifted impatiently and finally spoke into his communicator. "This is Park at surface. What are you seeing down there?" The response came from Dr. Velox himself. "We are seeing history, young human. We are seeing the birthplace of everything." Over the next 3 hours, the team set up a base camp inside the underground structure. Michael was finally allowed to descend, and what he saw took his breath away. The structure was massive, a domed chamber carved from the bedrock and lined with a metal that nobody could identify. The ceiling rose at least 100 meters above their heads, and every surface was covered in symbols. Strange angular markings that seemed to glow faintly with their own light. Michael walked slowly through the chamber. His boots echoed on the metal floor, and he felt like an intruder in a sacred space. The other team members were already taking samples and recordings, but he simply stood and stared. The symbols covered everything. The walls, the floor, the curved pillars that supported the dome. They were precise and deliberate, clearly a form of writing. But nothing in the galactic database matched them. Dr. Velox had already run the patterns through every known linguistic algorithm and come up empty. This predates everything the Corvani announced to the assembled team. "We have carbon dated the organic residue in the walls. The structure is approximately 50,000 years old." Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the group. 50,000 years ago, none of the current galactic civilizations had existed. The Corvani were the oldest known species, and their recorded history only went back 12,000 years. We are looking at evidence of a precursor race. Dr. Velox continued. His voice trembled with emotion. A civilization that existed before all of us. They built this place. They left these messages, and then they vanished. Michael listened to the excited chatter around him, but his attention kept drifting. Back to the symbols on the walls. Something about them nagged at the back of his mind. They looked familiar somehow, but he could not place why. He approached one of the walls and studied the markings up close. The symbols were arranged in neat rows. Like text in a book, some were simple shapes, lines and curves and angles. Others were more complex combinations of multiple elements. But there was a pattern to them, a rhythm that felt almost musical. One sequence in particular caught his eye, a row of 26 symbols arranged in a specific order. He stared at it for a long moment, and then shook his head. He was imagining things. Pattern recognition was a human trait, and sometimes it made people see connections that did not exist. The team worked through the night setting up equipment and cataloging the thousands of symbols that covered the chamber. Michael helped where he could, but mostly he stayed out of the way. The real scientist had no use for a cultural liaison, and they made that clear through polite dismissals and redirected questions. By morning, the base camp was fully operational, and Dr. Velox called a meeting to discuss their findings. He stood before a holographic display that showed the chamber from multiple angles and the symbols highlighted in different colors. We have identified over 300 unique characters, he explained. The writing system appears to be logographic, meaning each symbol represents a word or concept. We have found repeating patterns that suggest grammatical structure, but the meaning remains completely unknown. One of the other archaeologists, Archaeologist, Trevelyan with 6 arms, raised a question. How do we know this is writing at all? Could it be decorative or religious in nature? Velox nodded at the valid point. We cannot be certain, but the distribution of symbols follows statistical patterns consistent with written language. There is information encoded here. We simply need to find the key to unlock it. Michael sat in the back of the room, only half listening. His mind kept wandering back to that sequence of 26 symbols. He had counted them 3 times, and the number would not leave him alone. 26 was not a special number in Corvani mathematics or in any other alien system he knew of, but it was very special to humans. He told himself he was being ridiculous. The alphabet having 26 letters was an accident of history. It had nothing to do with an ancient structure on a frozen moon 50,000 light years from Earth. But the thought would not go away that night after the others had gone to their quarters. Michael returned to the chamber alone. He told himself he just wanted another look at the symbols. He told himself he was being a proper scientist, gathering observations before forming conclusions. He walked to the wall where he had seen the 26 symbol sequence, and he stared at it for a long time. Then, slowly, he began to trace the shapes with his finger. The first symbol was angular, with 2 diagonal lines meeting at a point. The second was rounded with a vertical line and 2 bumps. The third was a simple curve, facing right. Michael felt his heart begin to race. His hand was shaking as he moved to the 4th symbol, then the 5th, then the 6th. No, he whispered. His voice echoed in the empty chamber. No, that is not possible, but it was possible. He was looking at it right now. 26 symbols arranged in perfect order. The order that every human child learned when they first started school, except it was backwards. Z. YXWVUTSRQPONMLKJIHGFED CBA, the alphabet written in reverse. On a wall that was 50,000 years old, Michael sank to his knees and stared at the impossible message. His whole world had just changed, and nobody else in the galaxy had any idea. Michael did not sleep that night. He sat in the chamber until the artificial dawn cycle activated and the base camp began to stir. His eyes were red from staring at the symbols, and his mind was spinning with questions that had no answers. He had checked and rechecked his discovery a dozen times. The 26 symbols were definitely the Latin alphabet written in reverse order. But that was just the beginning. Once he knew what to look for, he started finding more whole sections of the wall. Contained readable text, hidden messages that only made sense when you flipped them backwards. One phrase appeared multiple times, carved larger than the others, and emphasized with decorative borders. When Michael reversed it, the words made his blood run cold. You were here, Firesti. He needed to tell someone, but who would believe him? The Corvani had already dismissed human writing systems as primitive and young. The Latin alphabet was only a few thousand years old according to galactic standards. These symbols predated everything by tens of millennia. Michael knew how this would look. Junior human liaison claiming to have solved a mystery that baffled the greatest minds in the galaxy. They would laugh at him. They would think he was desperate for attention or suffering from some kind of delusion. But he could not stay silent. The truth was right there on the walls, and someone had to see. Either requested an emergency meeting with Dr. Velox. The Corvani archaeologist agreed, but Michael could hear the skepticism in his translated voice. When Michael arrived at the command tent, he found not just Velox, but representatives from all 12 species on the team. They had gathered to witness his humiliation. He realized that now they expected him to make a fool of himself, and they wanted front row seats. Michael took a deep breath and activated the holographic display. He had prepared images of the symbols with his analysis overlaid in bright colors. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "I know this is unusual, but I believe I've made a significant discovery about the precursor writing system DR." Velox made a gesture that the translator interpreted as polite attention, but Michael could see the way the other scientists were exchanging glances. They were already preparing their dismissals. These symbols, Michael continued, pointing to the sequence on the display. "They are not unknown to me. I recognize thema." Ripple of surprise moved through the room. That was not what they had expected him to say. The Trevelyan archaeologist leaned forward. "You recognize them?" From where Michael straightened his shoulders and spoke clearly. "They are the Latin alphabet, the writing system used by humans." Written backwards. Silence filled the tent for exactly 3 seconds. Then the laughter started. It began with a chittering sound from the Corvani delegation and spread to the others. Some species did not laugh in ways that humans could recognize, but their body language made their amusement clear. The human liaison had lost his mind. Dear Velox raised a limb to quiet the room. His 4 eyes focused on Michael with something that might have been pity. Young human," he said gently. "The Latin alphabet is a primitive script. It developed on your homeworld approximately 3,000 years ago. These markings predate your entire species by tens of millennia." "I know how it sounds," Michael replied. He kept his voice steady even though his hands were shaking. "But look at the sequence I am showing you. 26 symbols in a specific order. That is not a coincidence." The Corvani archaeologist made a dismissive gesture. "Pattern recognition is a known flaw in human cognition. Your brains evolved to find meaning in random data. It helped your ancestors survive on a dangerous planet, but it leads you to see connections where none exist." Michael felt his frustration rising. He had expected resistance, but not outright dismissal. They were not even looking at the evidence. "What about this phrase then?" he highlighted another section of the wall. "When you reverse the order and apply standard English letter values, it reads, 'We were here first.' Does that sound like random pattern matching to you?" Another wave of laughter swept the room. One of the delegates, a tall being with silver skin and no visible eyes, spoke up in a melodic voice. "Young human, do you understand what you are claiming? You are suggesting that your species, which only achieved space travel 2 decades ago, somehow built a structure 50,000 years before any other civilization existed. The same species that was still living in caves when my ancestors mapped the galaxy." Michael opened his mouth to respond, but Dr. Velox cut him off. "We appreciate your enthusiasm," he said. The words were kind, but the tone was final. However, we cannot allow personal bias to contaminate this historic discovery. You are emotionally invested in finding a connection to your own species. That is understandable, but it is not science, but the evidence. The evidence. Show symbols that superficially resemble human writing. Velox interrupted, nothing more. The statistical probability of such a coincidence is low but not impossible. Given enough random data patterns will emerge. Your job here is cultural liaison, not linguistic analysis. I suggest you return to your duties and leave the research to those qualified to conduct it. Michael stood frozen as the meaning of those words sank in. He was being dismissed, not just from the meeting, but from the discovery. They were going to bury his findings and pretend this conversation never happened. He looked around the room at the faces of the assembled scientists. Some looked amused, others looked bored. A few seemed almost sympathetic, but none of them believed him, not one. With as much dignity as he could manage, Michael gathered his materials and walked out of the tent. The door sealed behind him, and he heard the murmur of conversation resume. They were probably already making jokes about the crazy human who thought his alphabet was older than the stars. Michael walked to the edge of the base camp and stared out at the frozen landscape of Theta 7. The wind had picked up and ice crystals danced in the floodlights. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air, and he felt more alone than he had ever felt in his life. But he was not wrong. He knew what he had seen. The evidence was real, even if nobody else could accept it. He just needed to find a way to prove it. His communicator buzzed with an incoming message from Earth. The time delay was significant, but the Galactic Relay Network made interstellar communication possible within hours. Michael checked the sender and felt a small spark of hope. It was from his sister Grace. She worked for Earth Defense Intelligence Division as a cryptographer. If anyone could verify his findings, it was her. Michael retreated to his private quarters and composed a detailed message. He included all the images he had captured along with his analysis and his theory about the reversed alphabet. He knew he was taking a risk, sending potentially classified archaeological data through personal channels could get him in serious trouble. But he was out of options. The response came 12 hours later. Michael read it 3 times to make sure he understood. Little brother, Grace had written, "I ran your symbols through every decryption algorithm. I have access to. You were right about the Latin alphabet, but you only scratched the surface. There are multiple layers to this code. The outer symbols are reversed English. The middle layer uses a substitution cipher based on prime number positions. And the core message." Michael scrolled down and felt the world tilt beneath him. The core message is in Korean. She continued, ancient Korean Hangul characters that predate modern standardization. It says, "When the children return to the stars, remind them who built the road." Michael sat back in his chair and tried to process what he was reading. Korean Hangul was thousands of years old, but it should not exist in a structure that predated human civilization. Nothing about this made sense unless humanity had not evolved on Earth at all, unless they had been placed there, unless someone had deliberately hidden messages in human languages, knowing that only humans would ever be able to read them. Michael looked at his communicator and made a decision. The Galactic Council had dismissed him, but they would not be able to dismiss his sister or the evidence she had uncovered. He was going to get that meeting again, and this time they were going to listen. Grace Park had not slept in 36 hours. Her office at the Earth Defense Intelligence Division was littered with empty coffee cups and scattered printouts. The holographic display in front of her showed layer after layer of decoded symbols, and her eyes ached from staring at them. But she could not stop. Not now. Not when she was so close to understanding her brother had sent her something impossible. A collection of symbols from a structure older than human civilization that somehow contained messages in human languages. The first layer had been obvious once. Michael pointed it out. The Latin alphabet written backwards. Only a human would think to flip the sequence. Only someone who had learned their letters as a child would recognize the pattern. But that was just the beginning. Grace had spent her career breaking codes for the government. She had decrypted enemy communications and exposed hidden messages in seemingly innocent data. She knew that truly secure encryption used multiple layers, each one protecting the secrets beneath. The Theta 7 symbols were no different after identifying the reversed alphabet. Grace had noticed that certain symbols appeared more frequently than others. She ran a frequency analysis and discovered that the distribution matched prime numbers exactly. Every third symbol, every fifth, every seventh, every 11th. The pattern was unmistakable. She applied a substitution cipher using the prime positions, and a new message emerged. This one was more complex, written in a mixture of Latin and Greek, characters that spelled out coordinates and dates. The coordinates pointed to locations scattered across the galaxy, some in systems that humanity had not yet explored. But the real discovery came when she reached the innermost layer. Grace had almost missed it. The symbols were smaller and more intricate, carved into the spaces between the larger characters. She had to enhance the images multiple times before she could see them clearly, and when she finally recognized what she was looking at, her heart nearly stopped. They were Hangul characters, the writing system used in Korea for over 6 centuries. But these were older, much older. The character forms were archaic, using shapes that had not been standard since the early days of the script. Grace was not fluent in Korean, but she had learned enough from her grandmother to recognize the basics. She ran the characters through a translation program and then through a historical linguistics database to account for the archaic forms. The message that emerged was short but devastating. When the children returned to the stars, remind them who built the road. Grace sat back in her chair and tried to make sense of what she had found. A message written 50,000 years ago, in a language that should not exist for another 49,000 years. A message clearly intended for humanity. A message that implied humans had once traveled among the stars and then somehow forgotten. Everything she needed more data. The images Michael had sent were comprehensive, but they only covered a small portion of the structure. There could be other messages, hidden in other chambers, waiting to be discovered. Grace composed a reply to her brother explaining everything she had found. She included her full analysis, along with recommendations for where to look next. Then she added a warning. "This is bigger than archaeology," she wrote. "Someone hid these messages for a reason. They wanted used to find them, but only when we were ready. Only when we return to the stars ourselves. Be careful who you trust. The Galactic Council may not want this truth to come out." She sent the message and then sat in the darkness of her office thinking about what it all meant. If humans had once been a spacefaring civilization, what had happened to them? Why had they retreated to a single planet and lost all memory of their past? Was it a natural disaster, a war, a choice? And, perhaps most importantly, what did it mean for humanity now? The answer came to her slowly, a theory that explained everything but raised even more questions. The messages were not just historical records. They were instructions, a guide for humanity to follow when they returned to the stars. The coordinates she had decoded pointed to other locations, other structures, other pieces of the puzzle. Someone had laid out a path for humanity to follow, a way to reclaim their lost heritage and remember who they truly were. But who had done this, and why had they gone to such elaborate lengths to hide the truth? Grace did not have answers, but she knew someone who might. She picked up her secure communicator and placed a call to Admiral James Wright, the head of Earth Defense Strategic Command. He was going to think she was crazy, but he was also going to want to see her evidence. The call connected and Wright's weathered face appeared on the screen. His gray hair was disheveled, suggesting she had woken him up, but his eyes were sharp and alert. Agent Park, he said, "Do you know what time it is?" "Yes, sir," Grace replied. "But this could not wait. I need you to look at something. I think we may have found evidence that humanity did not originate on Earth." There was a long pause. Wright stared at her through the screen, and Grace could see him trying to decide if she had lost her mind. Then he sighed and rubbed his eyes. "Send me what you have," he said. "I will look at it first thing in the morning." With respect, Sir Grace interrupted. "You need to look at it now before the Galactic Council decides to bury it." Another pause. "This one longer." Than Wright nodded. "Slowly transmitting now," he said. His tone had changed from dismissal to concern. "Start from the beginning." Grace spent the next 2 hours walking the Admiral through her analysis. She showed him the reversed alphabet, the prime number cipher, and the Korean message. She explained her theory about the coordinates and the possibility of other structures waiting to be discovered by. The time she finished, the sun was rising over the Washington skyline, and Admiral Wright looked like a man who had just watched his entire understanding of the universe collapse. "If this is real," he said slowly, "then everything we thought we knew about human history is wrong." "Yes," Sir Grace agreed. "That is why we need to act fast. My brother is on Theta 7 right now. The Kolvani already dismissed his findings. If they decide to restrict access to the structure, we may lose our only chance." To learn the truth, Wright was quiet for a moment. Then he straightened in his chair, and Grace saw the military commander emerge from behind the tired old man. "I'm going to make some calls," he said. "We have ships in that sector. We can have a full research team on Theta 7 within 72 hours. "What about the Galactic Council?" Grace asked. "They are not going to like us interfering with their dig." Wright smiled, and it was not a friendly expression. "Let me worry about the Council, Agent Park. You just keep working on those codes. I have a feeling there is a lot more to find." The call ended, and Grace slumped back in her chair, exhaustion finally catching up with her. She had done everything she could. Now it was up to others to act on what she had discovered. But even as she closed her eyes, one question kept circling in her mind. The message had said, "When the children return to the stars." That implied someone was waiting for humanity, someone who had known they would come back, someone who had prepared for this moment across 50,000 years of silence. Who were they? And where were they now? Grace did not know. But she had a feeling she was going to find out soon, whether she wanted to or not. The human ships arrived at Theta 7 3 days later. Michael watched them descend through the frozen atmosphere and felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He was no longer alone. Admiral Wright had sent a full research vessel along with a military escort. The Galactic Council had protested, but Earth had invoked its rights under the Interspecies Archaeological Treaty. Any member species could request independent verification of major discoveries. The Council could not refuse without violating their own rules. Develox was furious. Michael could tell by the way the Corvai Archaeologist kept clicking his mandibles and pacing outside the command tent. He had been forced to grant the human team full access to the structure, and he clearly hated every moment of it. The lead researcher from Earth was Dr. Emily Lee, a woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She had studied ancient languages for 30 years, and she was the best in her field. When Michael showed her his findings, she did not laugh. She listened. "You found all of this on your own?" she asked after reviewing his notes. "Yes," Michael replied. "I knew nobody would believe me without solid evidence, so I documented everything." Dr. Lee nodded slowly and looked at the holographic display showing the chamber walls. The reversed alphabet was highlighted in blue, and the decoded phrases glowed red. "Your sister did excellent work on the cipher layers," she said. "The Korean message is particularly significant. Hangul was designed to be easy to learn, a deliberate choice by its creators. It makes sense that a precursor civilization would use it for a message meant to be found." Michael felt validation wash over him after days of being dismissed and ignored. Finally, someone was taking him seriously. "But we need more," Dr. Lee continued. "Physical evidence that cannot be explained away as coincidence. The Council will not accept linguistic analysis alone. They will claim we are seeing what we want to see." "What kind of evidence?" Michael asked. Dr. Lee gestured toward the chamber. "The walls contain organic residue, old cells that were somehow preserved in the metal. We need DNA samples, and not just a few. We need enough to build a complete genetic profile. That was when the second discovery happened. The human team had brought equipment far more advanced than what the Galactic Council used. They can analyze materials at the molecular level and detect traces that other methods would miss. When they ran their scanners over the chamber walls, they found something nobody expected. The organic residue was not random contamination. It was deliberate. Cells had been embedded in the metal at regular intervals, forming a pattern that matched the symbol placement. Someone had literally written in DNA, "WE can extract and sequence it, Doctor," Lee announced to the combined human and alien research teams. The Corvani watched with obvious skepticism, but they could not interfere. It will take approximately 12 hours to get results. Those 12 hours were the longest of Michael's life. He paced through the base camp unable to eat or sleep. The implications of what they might find were almost too big to comprehend. If the DNA was human, if it matched modern human genetics, then everything would change. The results came at 3 in the morning. Michael was sitting in the analysis tent when Dr. Lee called him over. Her face was pale, and her hands were a shaking. "Look at this," she whispered, pointing to the display. Michael looked. The screen showed a genetic sequence compared against the baseline human genome. The match percentage was displayed in large numbers at the bottom, 99.7%. The DNA embedded in the walls of a 50,000-year-old structure was human, not similar to human, not related to human, actually human, nearly identical to the genetic code of every person alive on Earth today. How is this possible? Michael breathed. Dr. Lee shook her head. "I do not know. But this is not something we can fake or misinterpret. This is physical, biological proof that humans are something genetically indistinguishable from humans. Built this place tens of thousands of years before our species supposedly existed." Michael thought about what this meant, and the answer that emerged was both terrifying and exhilarating. "We did not evolve on Earth," he said slowly. "Someone put us there. Someone moved our ancestors to a single planet and then erased their memories, made them forget everything they knew, made them start over from nothing." Dr. Lee nodded. "That is what the evidence suggests. But why? Who would do such a thing? And how did they manage to engineer an entire species to forget its own history?" Michael did not have answers, but he knew someone who might. The Galactic Council had thousands of years of records. Maybe somewhere in their archives was evidence of what had happened to humanity. Maybe other species remembered what humans had forgotten. He requested another audience with the full council, this time backed by Dr. Lee and the genetic evidence. The meeting was tense. The Corvani delegation sat in stony silence while the human researchers presented their findings. Dr. Velox listened to everything without interrupting. When Dr. Lee finished explaining the DNA results, he spoke in a voice that the translator rendered as completely flat. "This changes nothing," he declared. "The precursor race may have been genetically similar to humans. That does not make them your ancestors convergent. Evolution is a known phenomenon. Perhaps human-like biology is simply optimal for intelligent life." Michael felt his patience finally snap. He stood up and faced the assembled delegates directly. "You can deny it all you want," he said, "but we both know the truth. You have spent centuries believing your civilizations were the oldest and most advanced. You told yourselves that humans were primitive newcomers barely worth noticing. And now you are learning that we were here first, that we built structures and traveled the stars while your ancestors were still developing basic tools." The chamber went silent. Every eye was on Michael. Some looked angry, others looked shocked. A few seemed almost afraid. The Trevelyan delegate spoke up. His melodic voice carried a note of challenge. "If what you say is true, then where did your ancestors go? What happened to this great civilization of yours?" "I do not know," Michael admitted, "but I intend to find out." My sister decoded coordinates from the symbols' locations scattered across the galaxy. Other structures like this one waiting to be discovered. Your precursor race left a trail for us to follow. And we are going to follow it. Dr. Velox made a sound that the translator could not interpret. Then he spoke, and his voice carried a weight that silenced everyone else. If humans were truly the precursors, then there is a question you should be asking yourselves. A question that is far more important than who built what. Michael frowned. What question? What drove them away? The Gravani asked. His 4 eyes locked onto Michael with an intensity that sent chills down his spine. Your ancestors built an empire that spanned the galaxy. They had technology we cannot begin to understand. They were here first as you say. And then they vanished. Velox leaned forward, his insectoid face somehow conveying profound unease. Something made them run. Something made them hide on a single planet and forget who they were. Something scared them so badly that they chose extinction over confrontation. The chamber was completely silent now. Every delegate was watching Michael, waiting for his response. Before you go chasing their trail, Velox continued, perhaps you should ask yourselves, what were they running from, and is it still out there waiting? Michael had no answer. The question hung in the air like a dark cloud, casting shadows over everything they had discovered. He looked at the symbols on the wall. The message that had started everything came back to him when the children returned to the stars. Remind them who built the road. For the first time, Michael wondered if that message was a welcome or a warning. 6 months had passed since the discovery on Theta 7, and the galaxy would never be the same. Michael stood at the window of his new office on Earth, looking out at the sprawling campus of the Precursor Studies Division. The facility had been built in record time, funded by every major government on the planet. Humanity had united behind a single purpose for the first time in its history. They wanted answers. The Galactic Council had been forced to acknowledge what they could no longer deny. Humans were not newcomers to the stars. They were the oldest known spacefaring species in the galaxy. The structures they had built predated every other civilization by tens of thousands of years. Some species had accepted this revelation with grace. The Trevelyan's had actually seemed relieved, as if a puzzle they could not solve had finally found its answer. Others, like the Gravani, struggled with the implications. Their entire culture was built on the belief that they were the eldest children of the stars. Learning that humans had preceded them by millennia was a blow to their identity that would take generations to heal. Michael turned away from the window as the door to his office opened. Dr. Emily Lee entered, followed by 2 younger researchers. David Kim was a historian specializing in ancient Earth languages, and Jessica Wright was an astrophysicist who had developed controversial theories about human migration patterns. Both of them had been recruited personally by Michael. We have the latest reports from the survey teams, Dr. Lee announced. She pulled up a holographic display showing a star map dotted with glowing points. 47 sites confirmed so far, all of them containing the same genetic markers and linguistic patterns. Michael studied the map. The points formed a rough spiral radiating outward from a central region that was conspicuously empty. No structures had been found there despite intensive scanning. Just dead space and silence. David stepped forward with a tablet in his hands. The translation work is progressing, he said. We have decoded over 3,000 phrases now. The language structure is becoming clearer. It appears to be a constructed language designed to be easily learned by anyone with basic human cognitive patterns. What are they saying? Michael asked. David hesitated before answering. Warnings, mostly directions to caches of preserved technology. Instructions for rebuilding certain systems. But there is also something else, a recurring phrase that appears at every single site we have found. He pulled up an image of symbols that Michael had seen before. The Korean Hangul characters that his sister had first decoded when the children returned to the stars. Remind them who built the road. David read. And then there is always a second message right after it. What does it say? David looked uncomfortable. It says, remember why we left. Remember what waits in the dark. Do not go home. The room fell silent. Michael felt a chill run through him, despite the warm sunlight streaming through the window. Jessica Spoke up her voice carrying the precise tones of someone presenting data. "I've been analyzing the distribution of the discovered sites," she said. "They form a clear pattern of expansion starting from a central point and spreading outward over approximately 10,000 years. She pointed to the empty region at the center of the spiral. "This area here is where the expansion began. Based on the age of the structures, this should be the location of the original homeworld, the place where humanity first achieved spaceflight, but there is nothing there," Michael said. Jessica nodded. "That is correct. I have scanned the region with every instrument available. There are no planets, no debris, no residual radiation, nothing. It is as if an entire solar system was simply erased." Michael thought about the warnings encoded in the structures, the repeated messages telling whoever found them not to return home. Something had happened in that empty region, something so terrible that an entire civilization had chosen to flee and forget rather than face it. Dr. Lee pulled up another display showing biological data. "We have been analyzing the genetic markers in more detail," she said. "The DNA in the ancient structures is nearly identical to modern humans, but there are subtle differences. Modifications that do not appear naturally." "What kind of modifications?" Michael asked. "Enhanced neural plasticity." Dr. Lee replied, "The ability to learn and adapt more quickly than baseline human cognition would allow. It appears that our ancestors engineered themselves to be able to forget, to deliberately erase traumatic memories and start fresh." She paused and looked at Michael with troubled eyes. "They did not just run away from something. They designed themselves to forget why they ran. They made forgetting part of their biology." Michael absorbed this information and tried to understand what it meant. His ancestors had faced something so horrifying that they had altered their own minds to ensure they would never remember it. They had scattered across the galaxy, leaving fragments of their knowledge behind, and then retreated to Earth to begin again. That they had also left a trail, breadcrumbs for their descendants to follow when they were ready, warnings encoded in their own languages, hidden in plain sight for anyone human enough to recognize them. "What do we do now?" David asked. The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Michael looked at his team and then back at the star map. He thought about the empty region where humanity had begun and the something that had driven them away. He thought about the warnings and the fear that had been literally engineered into human DNA. "Keep looking," he said. "We follow the trail and we gather every piece of knowledge our ancestors left behind. We learn everything they wanted us to learn." "And what about the empty region?" Jessica asked. "What about the warning not to go home?" Michael was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, and his voice was steady despite the fear he felt. "We honor the warning. For now, our ancestors knew more than we do. They had reasons for what they did, but we also need to understand what we are dealing with. We cannot protect ourselves from something we do not understand." He walked to the window and looked up at the sky. The sun was setting and the first stars were becoming visible. Points of light that suddenly felt both familiar and threatening. "Whatever drove us away is still out there," he continued. "Our ancestors hid us on Earth for 50,000 years. They bought us time to grow and develop and return to the stars. Now, we need to figure out if that time was enough, if we have become strong enough to face what they could not." The Arlie joined him at the window. "You think we can survive whatever it was?" Michael thought about everything humanity had accomplished in just the 15 years since first contact. They had gone from a single planet species to an active member of the galactic community. They had adapted and learned and grown at a pace that astonished even the oldest civilizations. "I think our ancestors did not run because they were weak," he said. "Slowly, I think they ran because they were smart. They knew they could not win that fight, so they retreated and regrouped and prepared for the next generation to try again." He turned to face his team and saw determination reflected in their eyes. "We are that generation," he said. "We are The children who return to the stars, and if something out there is waiting for us, we need to be ready. The holographic display behind him showed the spiral of discovered sites, stretching across the galaxy. 47 points of light marking the path their ancestors had traveled so long ago. And at the center, the dark, empty space where all of it had begun. Michael did not know what waited in that darkness, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty: humanity had been given a second chance. A chance to reclaim what they had lost and face what they had fled. Whatever came next, they would not run again. The stars were waiting. And this time, humanity was going to answer. The end.